Imagine this. You're driving home late at night, minding your own business, when suddenly red and blue lights flash behind you. A routine stop? Think again. Within minutes, you're yanked from your car, falsely accused, and thrown into a system designed to break you. But what if they messed with the wrong person? In this gripping story, Naomi Hayes, a highly trained intelligence officer, is framed by corrupt cops, but she's about to turn the tables in a way no one saw coming. Stay until the end to see justice served. Subscribe now and turn on notifications. This is one fight you won't forget. The streets of Savannah, Georgia, were eerily quiet, bathed in the glow of flickering streetlights. The coastal humidity clung to the air, thick and heavy, making every breath feel weighted. Naomi Hayes gripped the steering wheel of her sleek black sedan, her sharp eyes scanning the dimly lit road ahead. It had been a long night, longer than most, but her mission was complete. Another operation, another success. The counterterrorism investigation she had been working on for months had finally reached a turning point, and now it was time for her to disappear, just as she always did. She exhaled slowly, watching the road ahead as she turned onto a quieter street. The familiar hum of tires against asphalt was almost soothing, until she noticed it. A patrol car. She saw it in her rearview mirror, its headlights illuminating the road behind her like two predatory eyes in the darkness. They were following her. Naomi knew this neighborhood well, knew it was the kind of place where a black woman alone at night was a walking target. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. She had seen too many headlines, heard too many stories, and had faced enough of it herself to know how quickly things could spiral. Still, she forced herself to remain calm. She kept her hands at 10 and 2, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady. They had no reason to stop her. Her taillights were fine. She had obeyed every traffic law. Then, as if on cue, the red and blue lights flashed behind her, the deafening wail of a siren shattering the silence. Naomi's pulse quickened. Here we go. She signaled, pulled to the side of the road, and turned off the engine. She reached for her glove compartment, her fingers brushing against her phone, but before she could grab it, a voice boomed through a loudspeaker. "Driver, hands where we can see them. Keep them on the wheel." Naomi froze, then complied, lifting her hands back to the wheel. They were already aggressive. That wasn't a good sign. Footsteps crunched against the pavement as two officers approached. The first, Sergeant Lucas Grady, walked with the kind of arrogant authority that made Naomi's skin crawl. White, late 40s, a body built from years of unchecked power. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished, and his face wore a smirk that made her stomach turn. The second, Officer Daniel Knox, was younger. Mid-20s, maybe. Still eager to prove himself. His movements were rigid, his fingers twitching near his holster, his gaze flickering between Naomi and Grady as if awaiting approval. A follower, a dangerous one. Grady leaned down, shining his flashlight through her open window. "Evening, ma'am. Do you know why we pulled you over?" Naomi met his gaze, keeping her voice smooth and measured. "No, officer, I don't." Grady tilted his head as if amused by her calmness. "Broken taillight. License and registration?" Naomi didn't argue. She knew better. She moved slowly, methodically, retrieving her documents and handing them over. She wouldn't give them any excuse. Grady took them without looking, passing them to Knox. Then he stepped closer. You in a hurry tonight? Look a little nervous." Naomi's grip on the wheel tightened. They were baiting her. She wouldn't bite. "I'm heading home, officer, that's all." Grady exhaled through his nose, his smirk widening. "Step out of the vehicle." A knot formed in Naomi's stomach. This wasn't routine. This was an escalation. Still, she nodded, unbuckled her seatbelt, and stepped out, standing tall despite the tension thrumming through her veins. She wouldn't cower for them. Knox circled behind her, moving toward her trunk. "Mind if we take a look back here?" he asked. Naomi's patience began to wear thin. They had no reason. "Officer, I haven't given you permission to search my car." Grady didn't flinch. Oh, I think you'll want to reconsider. Then Knox called out from the back. Well, would you look at this? Naomi's stomach plummeted. She turned just in time to see Knox holding up a brick of white powder, a smug look plastered across his face. The world seemed to slow. That wasn't hers. It had never been in her trunk. This was a setup. Grady chuckled, stepping closer until he was just inches away. Well, looks like we got ourselves a real problem here, huh? Naomi's pulse roared in her ears. She had faced life-threatening situations before, had stared down enemies far worse than these men. But this was different. This wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger. She opened her mouth to speak, but Grady's hand was on her before she could react. A sharp shove sent her crashing against the hood of her car, the metal biting into her stomach. Got a runner, Grady taunted. He was enjoying this. Naomi grit her teeth, her breathing heavy as she felt cold steel tighten around her wrists. Then, Grady leaned in. Thought you people were smarter than this, he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. Her jaw clenched. She wasn't new to this game. They wanted her angry. They wanted her to react. But she wouldn't. Not yet. Get her in the car, Grady ordered. Knox dragged her toward the patrol car, but in the scuffle, her phone slipped from her pocket, landing face down on the pavement. She barely had time to register the crack of plastic before Grady's boot came down hard, crushing it beneath his heel. She was completely cut off. The ride to the station was long, the tension suffocating. Naomi sat in the back seat, her wrists aching, her mind racing. She knew how this worked. Every minute she spent here, every second she remained unseen, was another step toward an outcome she couldn't afford. By the time they reached the station, the taunts had turned into outright mockery. They dragged her inside, fingerprinted her, laughed as they took her mugshot, and tossed her into a holding cell like discarded trash. The system had been scrubbed. Her records, her history, her clearance. All of it was classified. Which meant, to these officers, she was nothing more than another black woman in the system. As Grady leaned against the bars, grinning down at her, she knew one thing for sure. They had no idea who they were dealing with. And that was their biggest mistake. Naomi sat in the cold, dimly lit holding cell, her hands resting on her lap as she steadied her breathing. The walls were cracked, the stench of sweat and old concrete hanging in the air. The silence was heavy, except for the occasional muffled conversation from the officers outside. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, but she wouldn't break. She couldn't. She couldn't. Her wrists ached from the tight handcuffs that had only been removed moments ago, leaving raw red marks against her skin. She had been here before. Not in a jail cell, but in situations where everything hinged on patience, strategy, and knowing when to strike. Sergeant Grady leaned lazily against the bars, sipping coffee from a dented travel mug, his smirk ever present. You know, I should be in bed right now, he drawled. Instead, I'm here, babysitting some no-name junkie. It's funny, really. You all think you can outsmart the system. You don't realize you are the system. Naomi met his gaze with an icy stare, refusing to take the bait. You're quiet. I like that, Grady continued. Means you understand what's coming. See, you can play tough all you want, but in a few hours, the judge is gonna love putting another drug dealer away. Your type makes it so easy for us. Her jaw clenched, but she said nothing. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Officer Knox stood behind Grady, arms crossed, but he wasn't smirking. He looked uneasy. His eyes flickered toward Naomi, then away, like he was struggling with something. Naomi took note of it. Doubt. A crack in the foundation. But it wouldn't help her. Not yet. She knew the police system well, knew that when an arrest was made, the suspect's background was checked almost immediately. But her records, her real ones, were locked away in a classified government database. The system wouldn't recognize her clearance. Right now, she was just Naomi Hayes, an unknown black woman in a holding cell, accused of drug trafficking. No one was coming for her. Not unless she made them. Naomi shifted slightly, angling herself toward the dim security camera mounted high in the corner of the cell. It was an old model, grainy, probably poorly maintained. Good. Her movements were subtle, deliberate. She reached up and brushed her hand against her earring, a small, seemingly harmless stud, but inside it was anything but. A covert distress beacon, a silent signal. She pressed her fingertip against the cool metal, feeling the barely perceptible click beneath her touch. The beacon activated. Now all she had to do was wait. At the front desk, Officer Miguel Torres scrolled through his screen, trying to ignore the tight feeling in his chest. He had worked under Grady for 4 years. He had seen what kind of cop he was. He had looked the other way when things didn't feel right, told himself it wasn't his problem. But this was different. He had seen the arrest, had watched Knox find the drugs in the trunk. He had seen Naomi's face, calm, calculated, unafraid. She wasn't like the others, and that bothered him. He drummed his fingers against the desk, debating, until finally he pulled up Naomi's file. Routine protocol. Except something was off. There was barely any history on her. No employment records, no past addresses beyond the last 5 years, no digital footprint. That didn't happen. He frowned, scrolling deeper into the system, but his stomach dropped when a red notification flashed across the screen. Access denied. Classified records. His blood ran cold. Who the hell was this woman? Officer Knox sat in the break room, nursing a coffee that had gone cold. His hands trembled slightly, but he didn't know if it was from exhaustion or something else. Something worse. He couldn't stop thinking about Naomi, about the way she looked at him. She wasn't like the others. Most people screamed, cried, pleaded. She had just watched. Like she already knew how this would end. A lump formed in his throat as Grady walked in, chuckling as he patted him on the back. Good work tonight, kid. That one won't be causing trouble anymore. Knox nodded numbly, his stomach twisting. Because deep down, he knew she wasn't guilty. And if they could do this to someone like her, they could do it to anyone. Back in the holding cell, Naomi sat still, counting the seconds. Her distress beacon had been activated for 14 minutes now. That meant her contact, Elijah Carter, had already received the signal. By now, he would be digging. By now, someone knew she was in trouble. She exhaled slowly, closing her eyes for just a moment, when the sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. Interesting. He hesitated at the bars, glancing over his shoulder before leaning slightly closer. "What are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Naomi tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Excuse me?" Torres shifted, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "I pulled your file, there's nothing there." He swallowed hard. "Nobody's that clean." Naomi said nothing, just studied him. Torres exhaled sharply. "Look, I don't know what you are, but whatever it is, you're dangerous." He hesitated before adding, "And I don't think you belong here." Naomi's gaze remained locked onto his, and then, for the first time, she smiled. "Gotcha." At that same moment across the city, Elijah Carter's phone buzzed. He was already in front of his laptop, the glow from the screen illuminating his face. The alert was brief but clear. Emergency code 17. Naomi was in trouble. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up police records, city logs, and anything that could give him a lead. And when he found it, his blood ran ice cold. Arrest report. Naomi Hayes. Charges. Possession with intent to distribute. Arresting officer Lucas Grady. No, Elijah had seen this before. This wasn't an arrest. This was a setup. His heart pounded as he opened his social media accounts, ready to do what he did best. It was time to make this viral. Before we dive into the next chapter of Naomi's fight for justice, let's take a moment. What are your thoughts so far? Imagine being in Naomi's position, falsely accused, isolated, and powerless against a corrupt system. It's a terrifying reality for many, but Naomi refuses to break. Do you support her fight? Show your support by liking this video and dropping a comment below. What would you do in her shoes? Every like, share, and comment helps spread this powerful story. Let's make sure voices like Naomi's are heard. Now, get ready, because the battle is about to explode. The air inside the Savannah Police Department was thick with tension. Something was wrong. The usual morning routines, the lazy chatter, the coffee runs, the paperwork, felt forced, artificial. It wasn't just another day at the station, because a storm was coming, and nobody was ready for it. Sergeant Lucas Grady's patience was wearing thin, very thin. The Naomi Hayes situation was spiraling out of control. First, Torres had started asking questions. The rookie, Knox, was acting skittish, and now there were rumors that her arrest was being questioned. Externally. Not good. Not good at all. He strode into the holding area, his boots clicking against the floor, and stopped outside Naomi's cell. She sat on the bench, her back straight, her face unreadable. That pissed him off. She should have been scared by now. She should have been broken, but she wasn't. And that meant she knew something. No more waiting. Grady turned to Knox, who stood by the door like a nervous child. Get her processed for transfer. His voice was a low growl. Now. Knox hesitated. Sir, don't we need approval first? Grady's nostrils flared. He was done playing games. Do you really think anyone's going to question it? You think the captain cares? Hell, by the time anyone asks, she'll be long gone. Knox swallowed hard but nodded. The papers were filed within minutes. A transport van was ordered. By noon, Naomi would be on a one-way trip to a federal holding facility miles away. Off the record, off the radar, and this whole thing would disappear. Or at least, that was the plan. Grady was at the front desk, signing off on Naomi's transfer, when the front doors burst open, and in walked FBI agent Cameron Steele. The room went dead silent. Steele's presence was unmistakable, the kind of man who carried authority like a loaded weapon. Tall, mid-40s, salt and pepper hair cut sharp, a suit so crisp it made the cops in the room feel like security guards at a mall. His badge glinted under the fluorescent lights as he held it up, his voice like steel against glass. Federal investigation. I need immediate access to Naomi Hayes' case files and arrest records. Grady's blood ran cold. He forced a casual smile. Agent Steele, huh? Can I ask what this is about? Steele didn't blink. I'm investigating systemic corruption in the Savannah Police Department, and your name keeps coming up. The words hit the room like a gunshot. Every officer nearby suddenly found something else to do, avoiding eye contact. Grady's fingers tightened around his clipboard. You got a warrant? He asked, keeping his voice even. Steele smiled, but it wasn't friendly. He pulled a folder from his briefcase, flipping it open. Court order, federal investigation into the Savannah PD, signed, stamped, unquestionable. Game over. Grady tried to speak, tried to play it off, but Steele wasn't done. Where's Naomi Hayes? A flicker of hesitation. Then, she's being transferred. Steele's expression darkened. Cancel it. Torres finally speaks up. Officer Miguel Torres stood in the hallway, his stomach in knots. He couldn't do this anymore. He had watched Grady plant the drugs. He had watched Naomi get thrown in a cell. And now, they were about to make her disappear. He had followed orders his whole career, kept his head down, avoided trouble. But today, he was done. He stepped forward. I saw it, the words cut through the air. Every head turned. Grady's face twisted in fury. What the hell did you just say? Torres swallowed hard. I saw you plant that bag in her trunk, Grady. So did Knox. Knox's head snapped up. Pure panic. Grady turned to him, his eyes filled with quiet murder. Knox's hands were shaking. He opened his mouth, closed it, then nodded. "It's true," he whispered. The silence was suffocating. For the first time, Grady looked scared. Because now, it wasn't just his word against hers, it was his word against two cops. Steele smiled. "That's all I needed to hear. Sergeant Lucas Grady, you're under arrest for falsifying evidence, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations." Steele's voice rang out as he stepped forward, reaching for his cuffs. Grady snapped. "You sons of—" His fist swung, but Steele moved first. In seconds, Grady was face first against the desk, his own cuffs locking around his wrists. For the first time in years, the biggest predator in the department was caged. The first thing Naomi saw when the cell door swung open was Agent Steele's face. The second, Grady being dragged past her, struggling against the cuffs. He locked eyes with her, his face red with rage. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled. Naomi tilted her head, smirked. "It already has." She stepped out, stretching her arms, finally free. But she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Hours later, in the quiet hum of his apartment, Elijah Carter uploaded the file. The body cam footage, the undeniable proof. A clear, HD recording of Knox reaching into the trunk with empty hands and pulling out a bag that wasn't there before. Of Grady, laughing, mocking. Of Naomi being shoved against her car, handcuffed like an animal. Elijah watched the progress bar fill. 10% uploaded, 35% uploaded, 60% uploaded, 100%. He took a deep breath. Then he hit post. Savannah cover-up. Justice for Naomi. Exposing Grady. The internet caught fire. National news picked it up within hours. The footage played everywhere. Protests erupted outside the station. Thousands of people flooded the streets, chanting her name. No more cover-ups. No more lies. The police department was forced into full crisis mode. The governor was ordering an independent investigation. And Grady, he was finished. Naomi wasn't just free, she was about to take them all down. The trial begins, and the world watches. The air inside the packed courtroom was suffocating, the kind of still, weighted silence that carried the weight of history in the making. Every seat was filled. Reporters, activists, attorneys, community leaders, and those who had waited their entire lives to see a crooked cop finally face real justice. Outside, the city of Savannah was on fire with protests. The steps of the courthouse were lined with signs. Justice for Naomi. Exposing Grady. No more cover-ups. Naomi sat at the defense table, her posture straight, her face unreadable. But inside, her blood ran cold. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every innocent life ruined by men like Grady. This trial had become a battleground for justice, and she would not lose. Sergeant Lucas Grady, once the untouchable predator of Savannah PD, now sat at the defendant's table, his orange jumpsuit clashing with the arrogance still lingering in his expression. His lawyers were ruthless, spinning a narrative designed to twist reality. Ms. Hayes was aggressive during the arrest. She resisted, forcing officers to use reasonable force. The drugs were found legally in her vehicle. Evidence is evidence. Naomi listened without flinching as they painted her as the villain, but the world had already seen the truth. Then her attorney rose. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let me show you what really happened." First, the body cam footage played. The jury watched in stunned silence as the screen showed Knox reaching into the trunk, his hands empty, and then pulling out a suspiciously placed brick of drugs. They saw Grady laughing as Naomi was shoved against her car, the handcuffs biting into her skin. Then they heard him. There's no reply. "Thought you people were smarter than this," Grady sneered in the footage, his voice sharp as a blade against the silence of the courtroom. The gasps rippled through the crowd. One juror clenched his fists. Then came the FBI reports. Agent Cameron Steele took the stand, detailing the pattern of false arrests linked to Grady. "We have reviewed over 20 cases where evidence was suspiciously found by Sergeant Grady." His voice was even, unshakable. "We believe Miss Hayes was another victim of this pattern, except this time, they picked the wrong person to frame." The room tensed as Officer Daniel Knox took the stand. Grady glared at him, eyes burning with warning. Knox's hands shook as he adjusted the microphone. For a moment he hesitated. Then he spoke. "I lied." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Knox swallowed hard, his face pale. "Sergeant Grady told me to plant the drugs in Miss Hayes's car. He told me we'd teach her a lesson, and that no one would question it." Grady bolted upright. "You little piece of—" "Order in the court." The judge's gavel slammed down. Knox kept talking, his words now pouring out like a dam breaking. "I was scared. I thought if I didn't do what he said, I'd be next, but I can't lie anymore. We framed her. We framed a lot of people." The jury sat in stunned silence. Grady looked murderous. And just like that, the case was over. The judge's voice echoed through the chamber. "Sergeant Lucas Grady, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for corruption, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations." The room erupted into cheers. Naomi let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Grady stood frozen. For the first time, he looked afraid. Knox received 5 years in prison with a reduced sentence for his testimony. Toros was placed on probation, his cooperation saving him from time behind bars. They had enabled the system, but in the end, they helped bring it down. As Grady was being led away, he turned to Naomi, sneering. "You think this changes anything?" His voice was dripping with defiance, but there was something else there too. Fear. Naomi stepped forward, her voice low, powerful. "It already has." Grady's smirk faltered. Then, for the first time in his life, he had no power left. The news exploded. Savannah PD shaken to its core as corrupt officer faces justice. Body cam footage exposes years of police corruption. Naomi Hayes, the woman who refused to break. The police department faced mass resignations. The mayor ordered a full investigation into Savannah PD. The FBI launched a federal review of all cases tied to Grady. And Naomi? She walked out of that courtroom a free woman, a fighter, a survivor, and above all, a woman who refused to be silenced. Weeks later, Naomi sat on a quiet beach, the waves crashing softly against the shore. Agent Steele sat beside her, his sleeves rolled up, the weight of their battle still heavy in the air. "So," he said, "what now?" Naomi smiled, taking a deep breath. "There's always another fight." The sun dipped lower, the sky turning a deep, burning orange. The world had changed, and so had she. But the battle for justice never ends. The trial had ended. The courtroom battle was over. But the war was just beginning. It started the day after Grady's sentencing. A high-ranking federal oversight team arrived at Savannah PD, their presence a chilling reminder that no one was untouchable anymore. The department, once ruled by unchecked authority, now had the eyes of the nation on it. Officers resigned in waves. Internal investigations were launched into past convictions. The police union scrambled to do damage control, but it was too late. The public demanded justice. People whose voices had been silenced for years, those wrongfully arrested, falsely accused, or mistreated, came forward. Case files that had been buried were suddenly being reopened. And the worst part? It wasn't just Grady. Multiple officers were found guilty of corruption. More body cam footage leaked. Evidence of wrongful arrests, planted drugs, falsified reports. Savannah PD was officially placed under federal oversight for the first time in decades. The system was forced to change, and Naomi's fight had made it possible. Naomi never wanted fame, but she had become a symbol. Her case was everywhere. Cable news, social media, the front pages of every major newspaper. The woman who took down a corrupt police department. The reckoning, how one woman exposed an entire system. A new era of justice. Her fight sparked national reforms. Congress introduced a new bill requiring stricter body cam regulations, federal oversight on drug arrests, and an anonymous whistleblower hotline for officers who feared retaliation. Cities across the country re-examined their police departments. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough. But it was something. A beginning. Officer James Keller had spent months questioning everything he thought he knew about the badge he once wore with pride. He had joined the force to do good, to make a difference. But instead, he had watched corruption thrive in front of him. Good people staying silent, bad people growing stronger, until Naomi's case, until he finally spoke up. And now, the FBI wanted him. Agent Cameron Steele met him in a small diner outside the city, neutral ground. He slid a manila envelope across the table. A job offer. Keller swallowed. For what? Steele leaned forward. Civil Rights Division. Internal Affairs. We need people who know the system from the inside. People who aren't afraid to hold the right people accountable. Keller stared at the envelope, his heartbeat hammering. For the first time in his career, he had done the right thing. And now, he had the chance to do more. Keller accepted the job, and Savannah PD had lost one of its last good cops. The ocean breeze was warm against Naomi's skin as she stood at the edge of the pier, staring out at the endless horizon. The case was over. Justice had been served. But she didn't feel relief. Not yet. There was still so much more to do. "You're restless," a voice said behind her. She turned to see Elijah Carter, his press badge hanging around his neck, a small notebook tucked under his arm. "I don't do resting very well." Elijah shook his head, chuckling. "The whole world is watching you now, Naomi. You could disappear if you wanted. You earn that much." She considered it, she really did. But deep down, she knew the truth. Corruption didn't stop with Savannah. It was everywhere. And she wasn't done yet. A low hum vibrated in her pocket. She pulled out her phone, a new message. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she exhaled, her choice already made. She turned back to Elijah. "I need to go." He studied her, then nodded. "Where to?" Naomi smiled, sliding on her sunglasses. "Wherever justice takes me next." She walked away, disappearing into the crowd, a fighter, a survivor, a woman who refused to let injustice win, and no matter how dark the road ahead, she would always be ready for the next fight. Naomi fought for justice. Now it's your turn to decide what happens next. She was falsely accused, framed, and thrown into a system designed to silence her. But she refused to break. She exposed the truth, took down corrupt officers, and sparked real change. But is her fight truly over? What do you think Naomi should do next? Should she take on another mission, uncovering more hidden corruption? Should she work to help others who were wrongly convicted? Or is there a bigger conspiracy waiting to be exposed? Drop arrows in the comments if you support Naomi's fight, and tell us, where should her journey go from here? Your voice matters, and we want to hear your ideas. And if you believe in standing up against injustice, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because this isn't just Naomi's fight. It's a battle for truth, and it's far from over. What happens next? You decide. What does this story mean for us? Naomi's fight isn't just fiction. It reflects real struggles happening today. Corruption, racial injustice, and abuse of power still exist, and cases like Naomi's remind us why we must stay vigilant. In an era of body cams, viral videos, and social media activism, the truth has more power than ever. But justice still isn't guaranteed. We must ask ourselves, how many innocent people have been framed, silenced, or ignored because they didn't have the resources to fight back? Naomi's story teaches us the importance of courage, accountability, and never staying silent in the face of injustice. As we move through 2025, we must continue demanding transparency in law enforcement, holding institutions accountable, and supporting reforms that protect the innocent. This isn't just a story, it's a call to action. Stand with those fighting for justice, educate yourself, speak out, vote for change. Because in the real world, not everyone is a trained intelligence officer who can fight back. But together, we can make sure no one has to battle injustice alone. What are your thoughts? Drop a comment below and let's keep this conversation going.